Well, thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate it. It's great to see so many people. And the project I've been working on has been to look into research to identify the influences and meaning behind a Franz Liszt piano piece called Vallée d'Obermann, and then to use all that analysis to inform my performance decisions. So I'll be speaking to all of that, and then to conclude the presentation, I'll be performing the piece in its entirety for you. So first I want to talk a little bit about Franz Liszt as a person. He was born in 1811 in Hungary, and when he was about 9 years old, he gave his first public piano concert. And as he went into his teens, he became a known name around Europe and a very established performer, and got to know a lot of people in high places. And when he was in his 20s, he became romantically involved with a French countess. And this was a problem for two reasons. One, she was married. And second, she had children. So it created a huge public scandal in France, and the Countess decided it was best if she left the country. So she and Liszt did what any Europeans would do if they want to escape reality. They moved to Switzerland. So Franz Liszt found himself in Switzerland in 1835 and spent a little over a year there. And during this time, he wrote a lot of music. He found work as a musician, but he also on his own wrote a lot of pieces, including a volume of piano music that included this piece, Vallée d'Obermann. So now I want to backtrack a bit and talk about what was going on in the world of Western music during this time. So at the beginning of the 1800s, the Western world of music was in what we now call the classical era. And classical music was very much defined by form and structure. And there were different types of structures and different types of forms, and typically there would be multiple melodies and a larger work, and there were certain patterns and conventions of how those would weave together. And around about the 1820s, we started to see a shift, and composers started to be less concerned about the form of the pieces and more about spontaneity and expression and drama and being able to evoke emotion out of an audience. And Franz Liszt was coming into his professional career around about this time that the change was happening. Another thing that was very popular was a lot of heightened drama and storytelling in music, and that's something called programmatic music. So programmatic music is essentially telling a story, but if not a story, it could be using a painting as a point of inspiration and trying to create music that somehow captures this painting, or maybe an idea of philosophy, or a natural landscape. And programmatic music wasn't new to what was then called, or what we call the Romantic era, which is what came after the Classical era. But it certainly became a lot more popular during the Romantic era. So coming out of the Classical era, we find ourselves in the Romantic era of music, where composers are now taking inspiration from things like art and nature and literature. And Franz Liszt in particular was big on literary associations in his music. Another shift that happened in this transition from the Classical era into the Romantic era of music was a focus on the performer. So in the Classical era, it was very much about the composer. You were performing a Beethoven symphony, or a Mozart concerto, or a Haydn sonata. And in the Romantic era, it became less about the composer and more about the performer, and what type of interpretation the performer could put into the music, and what type of expression that person could draw out of it. So I want to show you a picture, because Franz Liszt, this worked really well to his favor, because he was a very, very good performer, and that was one of the reasons he became so popular. So this was a caricature drawn after a concert that Franz Liszt did in Berlin in the 1840s. He was playing a piece that was somewhat well known, but had never been super well received. People knew it, they were mostly ambivalent to it, but when he performed it at this concert, there were people crying in the audience because they were so moved by the expression and the power that he put into this. Now, not only was he good at expression in his music, but he was a technically brilliant performer as well. His fingers could fly up and down the keys, and people were just in awe of what he was able to do. And so you might notice in this picture, there's a lot of young ladies that are making a big fuss over him, and a lot of gentlemen that maybe escorted them to this concert that aren't quite so happy about that. But we can liken this a little bit to the Beatles, the reception sometimes they would get. And Franz Liszt, he was the rock star of 1800s Western Romantic era music. And he was a bit of a caricature himself. He was thin and tall, and he had long fingers, and so it just kind of fit well into this stereotype of this magnificent piano performer. Now I want to talk a little bit about some specific influences of this piece, Vallée d'Obermann. So I mentioned that Franz Liszt in 1835 and 1836 was in Switzerland, and he was very taken with the Swiss landscape. He thought the Alps were absolutely beautiful, and a lot of the music he wrote during that time was based on natural images from the Alps and him trying to capture the beauty in his music. For this particular piece, it was more influenced by a French novel called Obermann. And that novel is about a man named Obermann who wanders I'll start from the beginning of that. So Obermann was living in France, and he felt very confined by the life that he felt had been planned out for him, and that included his social contacts and his career. He felt like he was in this box and he needed to escape from it. So he moved to Switzerland. And while he was in Switzerland, he wandered the Swiss Alps and began this search for his purpose in life. So we would say he had a lot of existential longing, where he was trying to discover what the meaning of his life was. And he went high and low all over Switzerland and in the beautiful mountains and everywhere, trying to discover what is the meaning of his life, what is his purpose. Now, a bit of a spoiler alert, in the end, after all this searching, Obermann concludes that his life has no meaning and there is no purpose to his life. So the novel's not exactly a light read for a day at the beach. Liszt was very inspired by it. And you may notice the similarity in the title between the novel and the piece of music. Vallée d'Obermann translates literally to mean Obermann's valley. But the valley doesn't mean anything geographic. Liszt was referring to an emotional valley with this. So as part of the Romantic movement in music, there was a lot of expression, as I mentioned. And in this piece, Vallée d'Obermann, Liszt really capitalizes that through emotional contrasts. The overtone of the piece is very gloomy and it has this air of uncertainty, but those moments of uncertainty are interjected with moments of clarity, and there are heavy feelings of despair and just sinking down that are interjected with moments of hope. Now, those more positive feelings are more fleeting. They don't last. They eventually get overtaken by the negativity, but there is very much a contrast that's present in the music that was meant to mirror that contrast between what Obermann is going through in his own personal journey in the novel. Now, another characteristic of Romantic music that's very important in this particular piece is called thematic transformation. And that means taking one melody and using it throughout the piece, but altering it to express different emotions. So you may recall I had mentioned that typically in classical music, there would be multiple melodies, and there were certain conventions for how those would fit together in a piece. So it was a bit of a new idea to have only one melody, especially in a larger piece. But you don't feel like you're listening to the same thing because he tweaks it a little bit in different sections. The notes might be a little different, or he puts a different texture with it. So it's a similar melody in each section of the piece, but treated differently to express a different emotion. And that was something Liszt was very good at, something important to Romantic music that very much drove the writing of this piece, Vallée d'Obermann. I'm going to play you some examples of the thematic transformation that takes place in this piece, starting with the very beginning, which is example number 1 up there. Now, if you don't read music, it's okay. You can just listen, but I thought for those that do read music, it might be helpful to follow along. The notes I boxed in red are the melodies that we want to pay special attention to. So this opening melody, a couple things we can notice about it. First of all, you're going to hear it's in a lower register of the piano, and that's a bit unusual. A lot of times when we hear a melody, especially for the first time, it's in a mid or upper range of the instrument. So right away, Liszt is trying to set a more gloomy tone for this, and that's why he uses the lower register of the piano for the melody. Another thing that you might hear when I play it is that most of the notes are descending. There's a few exceptions to that. It doesn't always go down, but the general arc of that melody is downward. And again, that's supposed to symbolize this depression and sinking down. So here's what that melody sounds like by itself. Now I'm going to play it with the rest of the notes so you can hear what it sounds like with all the other textures that are present. And notice how the other notes in there just add this feeling of uncertainty to this opening section. draw your attention to the first three notes of that melody, because these are going to be very important in this piece. And this is a big part of the thematic transformation that Liszt uses. The first three notes are all descending, they each get lower, and the second one is longer than the first and the third one, and we're going to hear that pattern throughout the piece. So here's those three notes by themselves. Now as we move to example 2, and this is at the beginning of the second section of the piece, that same pattern of three descending notes with the second one being longer than the first and third is going to show up. But now we're in a much higher register of the piano, and as we'll hear in a minute, the texture is very different. It's much more a feeling of calm and clarity. Here's what that melody sounds like by itself. So we hear that thematic transformation showing up, and here's what it sounds like with all of the notes. And now as we move into the third example, this is in another section of the piece when we really dig into Obermann's inner turmoil and this chaos and this tortured feeling that he's trying to reconcile. So you're going to hear some low notes in the piano, like a rumbling very quickly, and then I've boxed in red where the thematic transformation shows up. So we get these pattern of three notes, again, three descending notes, with the second one being longer than the first and third. And that's interrupted by these more chaotic passages in the right hand that aren't really supposed to be played in any particular rhythm or time, interrupted by this thematic transformation. So let's hear what this passage sounds like. And it goes on from there. Now in the next example, this is transitioning us out of that section of all the chaos and those tortured feelings. And it's the transition between that section and the final section. And here, this thematic transformation is treated very differently. We see those three note patterns boxed in red in example number 4, but there's nothing else going on when those are being played. It's completely a solo line. And in between those boxed phrases, there are two things. There's silence, which is meant to create its own sort of tension. And there are these low clusters of notes. And some scholars who have studied this piece believe that this is supposed to represent an inner dialogue that Obermann is having, where perhaps those three note sections are him asking a question internally. And the silence is him trying to come up with an answer, and those low clusters of chords are either the other part of his psyche attempting to answer the question, or perhaps him just coming to terms with what he feels is his doomed fate. Some have interpreted this as this section is supposed to sound like internal weeping. But let me play this for you so you can hear this thematic transformation, this same idea of these three note groups, and how differently it sounds with this treatment. And then it continues on. So out of that, we get to example number 5, and this is the final section of the piece. And here we see those three note groupings again, three descending notes with the second one longer than the first and third. but this one is treated with more of a feeling of serenity. And people who have studied Liszt and this piece believe that in this section, he's representing a divine presence as part of Obermann's inner search for what his purpose is. And so the texture of this is very calm and serene, but we hear the same melody or a similar melody that showed up earlier in the piece. Now, I resisted the urge to show you an example of this at the end of the piece because I don't want to give away the ending, but I'll play the beginning of this final section for you. And that's as much as you'll hear at the ending for now. So another point that was very interesting in this piece is what was happening to the construction of pianos around this time. So any history buffs might have thought that the 1800s also coincides with the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution had a huge impact on the way instruments were made and manufactured, and that included the piano. So one thing that happened is more keys were added to the instrument on the upper and lower ends. The piano currently now has 88 keys. That didn't happen until much later in the 19th century, but at the time that Liszt was performing, it had most of those 88 keys. But prior to his time, it had maybe about 10 to 20 less, depending on the instrument. So the piano grew in range, and Liszt used that to showcase more drama, that you could use these upper and lower notes. Another thing that happened was the piano got louder. And that mostly happened because of the change in materials that were used to make it. So prior to the Romantic era, pianos were, the frame of the piano was made primarily out of wood. And in the Industrial Revolution, they switched that to cast iron metal. And that allowed them to put heavier strings in and to have greater tension within the strings, because high tension strings in a wood piano, the piano would collapse. The wood couldn't support that. But now that they had these more efficient materials that could support stronger strings, that's what they used, the metal. Now, also about the strings, they changed the design of the strings. If you've ever looked inside a grand piano, and you're welcome to do that at the end of the presentation, in the past, what happened was the strings would go straight back, parallel to each other. So in the new model of the piano, and what's continued today, is there's a bit of overlap. So you may notice that on the inside of the piano, there appear to be two levels of strings, and usually it's the lower strings that move across some of the middle strings. So that created more volume. First of all, they were able to put longer strings in that way by using that diagonal design. Secondly, they, when the hammer would strike one of the strings, you would not only hear the vibrations from that string, but you'd hear overtones from the other strings that were above or below it, and it just created a more robust sound. So now the piano has a lot more power, which made it right for this dramatic music. Another thing that happened to pianos was a more sophisticated hammer mechanism was put in. And without getting into too much of the technical detail about that, previously, the hammer, when it would strike the key, would go all the way down to a low resting place. And that made it difficult to play notes quickly because it just took longer for the hammer to get to the string. So with this new mechanism that was called double escapement, the hammer would only come down partially. It would have like a midway resting point in its range. And so that allowed rapid passages to be played with a lot more clarity on the piano. And it meant that a pianist could strike a key repeatedly, or a group of notes repeatedly, and get a much clearer sound out of it, where that just wasn't possible with the old design. So that explains why, if you've ever tried to play a Romantic era piece, they tend to be filled with these very technically demanding passages, and it's because Liszt and other composers like him wanted to show off what the piano and the pianist could do with these rapidly moving passages and these rapid repeating notes. So all of this analysis now leads to the final step, which is the performance. And there are many, many decisions to make when you're performing a piece like this, but generally speaking, on a large scale, you would want to think about the arc of the piece and making sure that it mirrors the story of Obermann, that we hear these emotional contrasts and the highs and lows, and that that's really emphasized. And the mood of each section is important. If we think about the thematic transformation, what's the mood? What's Obermann experiencing in this section, and how are we going to use that knowledge to inform how we approach the keys and how we treat that section? I had mentioned briefly about the tension in this piece, and for me personally, I really like to highlight that tension in the moments of silence that there are. Sometimes they're between sections, sometimes in the middle of a section, but I feel like that silence is so beautifully awkward, and it just really helps to bring out the tension and those tortured feelings in the piece, as well as the contrast, all of the uncertainty versus clarity, despair versus hope. And considering the new features that were present in the piano at this time and how Liszt may have been wanting to show those off. The highest notes, the lowest notes, the rapid passages, the repeating notes. And on a smaller scale, the expression of each note and how that works within the group of notes and how to approach each key to get the right sound, how it connects to the right note to highlight whatever mood is going on in that section. So before I perform the piece, I've offered a listening guide for anyone that's interested, and if you would prefer to just sit back and take it in without thinking too much about it, that's completely fine. But if you liken it to when you hear a pop song, sometimes it's fun to know the meaning behind the lyrics, and it informs your listening of the piece. Same is true with this type of music. So if you'd like, see if when I'm performing it, you can hear the story of Obermann in the music and all he was going through. Can you hear the thematic transformation, both the longer melodies as well as those three-note groups that show up in different ways throughout the piece? See if you can identify the highs and lows, both in terms of high notes and low notes, as well as emotional highs and lows, and the louds and softs that were now possible on the piano. And there are plenty of rapid passages and repeated notes for you to listen for as well. So now I'm going to move over to the performance portion of this and perform for you Franz Liszt's Vallée d'Obermann.